Alright guys, in this video, I'm doing a first for myself. I didn't practice this before. I've never cooked this before in my life because I thought it was way too much work. But since this is a cooking YouTube channel, I felt like I had to try my very own beef Wellington. But I'll be honest with you guys, beef Wellington is not my favorite dish. I'm not a huge fan of tenderloin. I know people love it because it's super tender, but I feel like there are other cuts that might not be as tender, but are close to and pack way more flavor. And every single time I've had it, it's been too salty for me, and I think it's because of one extra ingredient that a lot of people put in there now, and we'll talk about that more in this video. So what I want to do in this video is kind of custom build my own beef Wellington the way that I would want to eat it. So with that being said, let me show you guys my version of beef Wellington. To start off, we'll be using a tied up rib capped steak. The idea came to me as I was thinking about making an individual beef Wellington using a filet mignon. And then I saw the rib cap steak and thought, it looks a lot like a big filet. So why not use a cut that has a similar shape, more fat, and definitely way more flavor. And so here we go. My first time ever making a beef Wellington, and I'm making it in a way that I've never seen it before. I'm sure that's a smart move. Using this cut is going to be challenging. It only has that shape at the moment because it's tied up, but I definitely don't want to serve the Wellington with the string at the end, so we'll have to come up with a plan to keep it together later. But for now, we're going to season this generously with salt and black pepper. Make sure to hit all sides, and this is going to go into fridge to chill for a few hours, if not overnight. The one we just looked at had a really pretty shape and was tied beautifully. But what if you get ones that don't look so great, like this one or this one? These need a little extra work. As I cut off the string and I unravel it, you can see all the stuff that they're trying to hide. It still has a lot of the silver skin and excess fat. I'm going to take some time to remove as much of it as possible. If the goal is to replicate a traditional beef Wellington that uses a tenderloin, taking off the excess fat and other gristly pieces is important. Take your time, respect this step, and just try your best to get as clean as possible. Once you're happy with the trim, roll the cap muscle back up as tight as possible and use your hands to form it almost like a really thick burger patty. Pull out the butcher string and tie it up. Make sure the string is in the center of the steak. If you need a video to show you how to make the butcher's knot, I'll leave a link for you to check out in the description below. And just like the first cap steak, season generously with salt and black pepper and throw into the fridge. While the steaks rest, we're going to work on the duxelle. In this recipe, we're going to use two types of mushrooms. The first one is going to be a cremini, also called brown mushrooms or baby bellas. These are a commonly used mushroom beef Wellington recipes. I thought there was something super specific, but after doing some research, they're just a slightly more mature white button mushroom. So if you can't find them, using a white button mushroom should be fine. And just for fun, I'm going to add in some portobellos. The debate is always whether or not you should wash your mushrooms. I think it depends on how you plan on using them and how much time you have. Washing them in water and letting them drain is great, but takes extra time and will make it difficult to get color on your mushrooms. For today's application, our goal is to extract as much water as possible, so in this situation, I would clean them by using a wet paper towel to wipe the caps, or use a brush to knock off any loose dirt that's visible. Portobellos are much more susceptible to hold onto dirt because of the wide exposed gills. So to get rid of the extra grit that may be present, I'm going to use a spoon to scrape them all out. If you want to keep them in, use a brush and wipe in the direction of the gills to get as much dirt out as possible. Roughly chop all your mushrooms into small pieces. I wanted them in even smaller pieces that I didn't really want to do with my hands, so I busted up my mini food processor and went through all the mushrooms with multiple batches. Do me a favor, in the comment section, comment with a $sign or whatever currency you use, and hopefully the good vibes will allow me to make a little extra money to get a real food processor. Next, mince some garlic and shallots or red onion. I had some red onion at home and I wanted to try cutting it the Michelin way. I saw a video of my guy teaching me how to cut onions this way. Shout out to Senpai Kai. If you guys aren't following him, make sure you do so. I don't think my onions are at the level that would be acceptable, but it'll still work fine for this recipe. The goal is to get them to almost melt into the pan. Now that all our veggies are prepped, let's make the duxelle. In a pan, add some oil until it starts to shimmer. Add in your onions and move them constantly. I want them to sweat, but I don't want to get brown. Once the onions are translucent, add the garlic and a few tablespoons of butter and some thyme. Once your butter is melted, add about a third to a half of your mushrooms. The more mushrooms you add into the pan, the longer it will take to evaporate. Now this process is going to take a while, and you don't want to rush it by cranking up the heat. Take your time. Stir it occasionally as it begins to sweat. Listen to a podcast. Stand and stare at it. Maybe have a glass of wine. while you stand and stare at it, and after some time, you'll see water starting to bubble around the edges, which is a good sign that tells us that the mushrooms are starting to cook down. And as that starts to happen, I wanted to create space in the pan for extra liquid to evaporate. Creating these quadrants seemed to work well, as you can see how much liquid is starting to channel towards the center of the pan. And as those mushrooms start to cook down and you create more space in your pan, you can add in the rest of the mushrooms. Once the mushrooms are almost cooked down, I'm going to add in some red wine. This step is optional. I add the wine to help scrape the bottom of the pan so that we can scrape up all that delicious concentrated mushroom flavor. Traditionally, duxelle is made with either Madeira or sherry, but use whatever you got. You can even use a little bit of stock. When the duxelle is finished, spread it onto a baking sheet and cut a diamond pattern to create space for the heat to escape and cool down quicker. For now, we're going to let this completely cool down before we move to our next step. Now that the duxelle is nice and cold, we're going to scrape it all out into a bowl and add in one more ingredient. I learned this from Chef John at Food Wishes. To his duxelle, he uses a truffle pate, but I'm going to be using this liver mousse instead. And this is the part of the video that I'm going to talk about the one ingredient I'm not using. I am not going to be using prosciutto or Parma ham. Personally, I think it makes the Wellington too salty, especially with the delicate flavor of a tenderloin. I feel like the cured ham always overshadowed the beef. In this situation, I think the mousse will add more complexity without making it too salty. I won't lie to you guys, this duxelle with that mousse in there was absolutely delicious. I could just sit here and eat the spread over toast all day long, but let's get back to the beef so that we can put it all together. Since there's no cured ham in this Wellington, I'm going to cold smoke these cap steaks before searing them. I think cold smoking adds flavor, but also gives you that sense of cured ham or bacon that reminds you of those salty cured flavors without adding the extra salt. Taste and smell go hand in hand. It's about creating those ratatouille-like food moments. So I'm going to cold smoke this for about an hour, just in case y'all are worried about me getting sick. At this moment, it's about 30 degrees outside, so it's basically like cold smoking a steak in a fridge. If you don't have a smoker, get a smoking gun with a few wood chips and a dome can be really effective. After an hour has elapsed, I'm going to get the fire really hot to sear, but not cook these steaks. We still want them to be cold and raw by the time we sear these things off. To do that, we're going to start with Korean newspaper that's been aged for 27 days to really seal in that cold smoke flavor. And then Fogo fire starters and Fogo lump charcoal. Find the hottest part of the fire and get a good sear on all sides of the steak. While the cold smoke will give you some sweetness, the hot fire will give us that charred flavor that will give our Wellington more complexity. Once the sear has been attained, we're going to bring them inside and brush it with Dijon mustard that's been thinned with a little bit of water. Brushing it while it's hot will help the steak absorb some of the mustard, then it'll go into fridge to chill. With all the heat it's been exposed to, the layers are probably loose and we want to make sure it keeps its shape, and we'll do that by chilling it. Okay, now up to this point, I felt really comfortable with all the steps. This is the part where I felt like I should have practiced this beforehand. After watching a bunch of videos, everyone says you want the puff pastry to be pliable but still cold. So as a precaution, I opened up the door and the windows in my kitchen. It was probably overkill, but I really didn't want to mess this up. So I followed the thawing instructions on the box. I thought the pastry had thawed enough, but it didn't. And it cracked. I was panicking trying to put it back together. I had to shingle the layers, pinch the segments back together, and then try to make an even layer. So pro tip, let your pastry thaw out properly before working with it. I am just not used to working with this kind of stuff, which is why I think it's important to work on your other skills other than just working on the smoker and the grill, because things like this come up and you want to be prepared. Okay, now that we have our puff pastry back into one sort of uniform sheet, let's start building the Wellington. This will not be your traditionally rolled Wellington. Start with a small puck of the duxelle, roughly the same circumference of the steak. While the steak was still in the fridge, I cut the string just to keep it as cold as possible. And success! It held its shape. I thought it might just all fall apart, and then I would have to figure out another video to do. But it worked, and I'm super happy. Next, we're going to fold the edge of the puff pastry on top to seal it. After folding in a segment, I put a little bit of egg wash and then folded another section on top for it to stick. And I know with all these other folds, it kind of looks messy, but this is going to be the bottom of the Wellington, so when we flip it over, the top will look nice and smooth. Pack the sides nice and tightly, carefully move it to a lined baking sheet, brush the top with egg wash, and sprinkle with coarse salt on top. And it'll go into a 375-degree oven until we get the color on the pastry and the internal registers at about 100 to 115. Once we hit the internal, let it rest for at least 20 minutes. This Wellington doesn't look like any other I've seen. This one looks more like a loaf of bread. Especially with the areas we shingled with the pastry, it looks like we scored the top of a sourdough bread and it kind of split open during the baking process. But the color looks great. I'm just happy the pastry didn't fall apart during the cooking process. Now, let's cut this thing open. Alright guys, let's talk about it. I'll admit, I overcooked it. I didn't take into account how much the carryover cooking would be. So this was a little bit bummer to see, just learn from my mistake. Remember earlier I said to pull it out at 110 to 115 degrees? I pulled my Wellington out about 125, which is far too late if we're considering carryover cooking. Also be aware that once the internal hits about 90 degrees, don't walk away. As internal starts to rise, it will also cook faster. It's kind of slow in the beginning because everything from the puff pastry, the duxelle, and the steak have been kept really cold this entire time. Kind of like a brisket, it has a big stall in the middle and then it'll just shoot up. Knowing this piece of information, I'm really excited to try this again and get the internal that I'm really looking for. But besides that, how was it? No joke, it was the best beef Wellington I've ever had. The puff pastry on top was nice and light, while the bottom of all the sections we folded in soaked up a lot of the juices and the fat from the steak and the duxelle, but still had crunch. The duxelle with the mousse was amazing. It was probably the best part of the dish. With the extra savory flavors from the duxelle and the cold smoke on the steak, I think we accomplished adding more flavor and cured-like flavors without having it become too salty with the prosciutto and Parma ham. And using that rib cap steak instead of a tenderloin, it was just so much more flavorful. And getting a collective bite from the light crispiness from the top of the Wellington with that ribeye and that duxelle, it was a perfect bite of food. And the sauce that you see at the bottom of the plate is a wine reduction sauce that I'll show you guys how to make in my next video. So if you guys are planning on doing a beef Wellington during this holiday season, I would highly recommend trying out this beef Wellington. Alright guys, there you have it. That's my version of beef Wellington, and I feel like those small switches that I made, it just makes a dish slightly more balanced. It is still extremely rich, and it's one of those dishes that should be made for special occasions because there was so much work involved. But I think not having to buy a tenderloin or having to worry about getting the Chateaubriand and getting that perfect size and perfect cylinder, I felt that it just made a significant difference for the flavor. And you know, even though I did slightly overcook it, like I felt like it was just as tender as you know, as any other beef Wellington I've had, honestly. And lastly, the thing that I thought really made this is taking out the prosciutto or the Parma ham, season the beef properly, you season the duxelle, which is super concentrated. And by no means do I think I'm a beef Wellington expert. Again, this is the first time I did it, and you guys saw how much I struggled to wrap the pastry around the beef, but this is just another option for you to do. I also hope that this video gives you an inside look to kind of like how I think when I'm trying to, you know, create new dishes or to recreate them in a slightly different way that seems to make a little more sense to me. Alright guys, so that's the end of this video. If you guys enjoyed it, please make sure to like, subscribe, share this video with friends, and I'll see you guys in the next one.